Good day. Today is Monday, 25th August 2025. As you can see, I'm back in London in my room. However, returning to London proved an incredibly complex and difficult and time-consuming operation because of the traffic, the building works on the roads, the inordinate delays. This is why this video is going to be late tonight. And I'm afraid it's also going to be why this video is going to be short tonight. I apologise for this. It is another symptom of the deeper crisis in Britain that I discussed in my programme yesterday. The concerns that some are expressing that Britain is heading towards a financial crisis. In fact, I should say that whilst I was out of London, I saw yet further signs of economic distress. And I also saw symptoms which I will discuss perhaps more thoroughly in a programme which we will do on the Duran, that parts of the population at least are becoming increasingly exasperated by the situation and that we might indeed be closer to a social crisis than I had, to be frank, imagined. But I'm not going to discuss this further in today's programme because, as I said, this programme is going to be a short one and it is going to be about the major geopolitical issues that concern this channel and our channel on the Duran, and it is about those that I wish to speak. So the first thing is that over the next couple of days, Vladimir Putin, president of Russia, will be travelling to China. He will apparently be hosted there by President Xi Jinping on Friday. This will be a meeting connected with the meeting of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. Prime Minister Modi of India will also be there. There will be apparently 4 days of meetings over the course of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting, and Putin will be there for all of them. So we will have three of the most powerful leaders of the world, Putin, Xi Jinping himself, and of course Modi, in China at that time. And it is likely that there will be other important leaders there too. 20 heads of government or heads of state in total will apparently be attending this meeting. And I understand that Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations, has also decided to come, which is perhaps, given that he is something of a weather vane in these matters, is perhaps a further sign of the importance of this meeting, which is going to be taking place in China. Now, on the Duran, we recently did a program, Alex Christoforou and myself, in which we discussed how the sanctions and tariff pressure that the United States has been exerting, not just on Russia now, but on other key BRICS states, China, of course, but also India and Brazil, far from causing the BRICS to splinter, is in fact consolidating BRICS. It is bringing them closer together. And by the way, I should say, in parenthesis, that next year, in 2026, it is India, not Brazil anymore, which will be leading the BRICS and which will be taking the process of BRICS integration further, which is undoubtedly one of the main topics that Modi will want to discuss whilst he is in China with Putin and Xi and with the other leaders who are there. Anyway, we can see how this is playing out, and I said that Guterres is a weather vane, and the fact that he's turning up at this meeting in China shows the importance that the global community is attaching to it. I don't think that in the United States, the extent to which these processes of BRICS integration are underway is even now fully understood. Far too many people in the United States, in Europe, still can't quite bring themselves to believe that BRICS is for real and what it is doing is important. They still find it difficult to understand that events in the global south now matter more than they have at any previous time. The president himself, Donald Trump, does have some sense of this, as I suspect do other officials in the US administration. But none of them taken together seem to be sufficient to change the mood of indifference and disinterest that you find across the West, and the general sense that BRICS, though threatening in some respects, is still basically a house of cards, and a few tariffs here and a few sanctions there are going to be enough to knock it down. Well, that is wrong. Meanwhile, the President of the United States and the various European leaders and President Zelensky continue to maneuver around each other in the aftermath of the summit meetings between President Trump and President Putin in Alaska, and President Trump and President Zelensky and the European leaders in Washington. And President Zelensky has been very busy, and he's been talking a lot. He continues to insist that all territory occupied by Russia, including Crimea, of course, continues to be Ukrainian, that this is sacred land for Ukraine, that Ukraine must have it back at some point, that there is no possibility of Ukraine ever recognizing that it is Russian in any form. He continues to talk about security guarantees, about Ukraine's right to join NATO, about all of those things. He also, by the way, continues to demand weapons and money. This has been the constant theme of Zelensky's presidency. So he is now demanding that Ukraine be given by the Western powers. He means specifically now the European powers, $1 billion a month in order that Ukraine can be able to arm itself in order to continue the war. I'm not clear whether he means $1 billion a month of military assistance or outright money transfers of up to $1 billion so that he can buy weapons from the United States and wherever else he can find them and do so directly without having to go through the Europeans. I'm not sure which it is, but he wants money, he wants more weapons, he wants to be able to continue the war. And incredibly, the Europeans continue to want to give him more weapons. So the Norwegian government, which is admittedly one of the wealthier governments in the European Union, has, well, not in the European Union actually, but in NATO, they have massive oil and gas receipts, and of course they also have a significant and very sizable sovereign wealth fund. But Norway, for all that, remains a small country. Anyway, the Norwegian government has pledged another 600 million euros, I believe, or dollars of assistance to Ukraine. And remarkably, the German government, which is taking on debt at extraordinary speed, which is in the third year of recession, is now saying that it is going to give Ukraine 9 billion euros of assistance each year for the next 2 years. And this coming shortly after the Chancellor of Germany, Friedrich Merz, has told the German people that their welfare state, their social programs, which, by the way, in Germany have a long history, going back to Bismarck in the 19th century, that this welfare state is now unaffordable, that major cuts in welfare spending must now take place, even as Germany spends money on infrastructure. Of course, it's not really going to spend money on infrastructure. Well, rather, it is going to spend money on infrastructure. It's unlikely it's going to build very much infrastructure. But above all, Germany is going to spend money on weapons that it's going to try to produce itself. I mentioned in a recent program that there are said to be capacity constraints, making it difficult for Germany to actually make many of the weapons it says it is now going to make. And in practice, as I've also said in various programs, to the extent that there is going to be a German rearmament initiative at all, it is going to be carried out with weapons bought by Germany from the United States. That is inevitably, inexorably where all of this is going. So even as Chancellor Merz talks all about economies in welfare spending, cutting back on social spending, something that the Germans, by the way, have become very used to. They've come to think of this as absolutely a part of German life. As I said, the German welfare system has a very, very old history. Anyway, even as Chancellor Merz is now hinting that all of this must now be overturned, his government continues to demand that the Germans make more and more sacrifices on behalf of Ukraine. Or is it even Ukraine? Is it perhaps rather President Zelensky himself? Because, of course, opinion polls coming from Ukraine now speak of an urgent desire on the part of Ukrainians for a peace settlement. But apparently, President Zelensky continues to say no, as I discussed at the start of this program. So we see that there are people in Europe who are prepared to give President Zelensky money, even as their own economies go into ever deeper financial crisis. And of course, Ursula von der Leyen and the Europeans in general, Friedrich Merz in particular, have agreed that Europe will buy weapons for Ukraine directly from the United States. President Trump himself, US Secretary of State Marco Rubio, other American officials are now all saying that the days of the United States providing money for Ukraine are over. Ukraine will have to buy whatever weapons it gets from the United States. Either the Europeans will do it for Ukraine, or perhaps Ukraine with European money will be able to do it directly. But anyway, the money transfer from the United States, both in weapons and money, at least in theory, has ended. I suspect that in practice, some money will continue to flow to Ukraine directly from the United States. I spoke about how, in a previous program, how the IMF and the World Bank will probably transfer funds to Ukraine. And of course, most of these probably do originate in the United States, but it is clear that it is the Europeans who will carry the burden of this. And on the vexed topic of security guarantees, President Trump of the United States has now made further comments. He has said that the burden of security guarantees will be borne by the Europeans. The exact nature of those security guarantees has not yet been fully worked out, but they will be ultimately European. The Americans may play a role, or perhaps they won't, who knows, but any security guarantees, the burden will fall on Europe. And to quote his exact words, security guarantees, because we haven't even discussed the specifics of it, and we'll see. Number one, Europe is going to give them significant security guarantees, and they should, because they're right there. We'll be involved from the standpoint of backup. Well, we've already said that these security guarantees that Trump might be talking about now, that the Europeans might be talking about, fortunately for them, are never going to be given because the Russians have already said no, and because they are fighting a war with Ukraine, and because the Western powers don't want to fight Russia, so they're not going to give Ukraine security guarantees whilst that war is underway. The Russians, to all intents and purposes, have a veto over this whole topic. But again, we see how the Europeans are embracing more burdens, more responsibilities, even as their economies decline, even as the burdens increase, and even as President Zelensky's demands simply go on growing. Never the one word peace. Never the word peace. Never the word peace from any European leader. They're not happy with the fact that President Trump met with President Putin. Sometimes they pretend that they are, but you can see deep down that they really are not. They would rather that the Americans never talked to the Russians at all. Never the word peace from them. They've never put forward any really rational peace initiative which goes beyond Zelensky's own demands. They've never really, at least publicly, told Zelensky, enough's enough. This has to end. You have to sit down and talk with the Russians intelligently and seriously and see what you can agree with them, because we cannot go on helping you in the way that we have been doing up to now. I spoke at the start of my program about the first very strong glimmers of social unrest in Britain, which I saw for the first time over the course of my holiday. Well, I suspect we are going to get a lot more of that soon. And suffice to say that in Britain, Reform UK, Nigel Farage's party, now is polling 33% of the vote, as against 18% for the governing Labour Party and 17% for the Conservatives. Farage is polling just short of double what the Conservatives and Labour are polling together. Now, that would have seemed incredible just a year ago, but that is where we are. And this is a steady position in the opinion polls now. And of course, in Germany, the AfD has now surged ahead of the CDU and is Germany's biggest party, again, according to the opinion polls, at least its most popular party. By the way, and quickly, and in parenthesis, I wonder how Merz's coalition partner, the SPD, the Social Democratic Party of Germany, the defenders and, to some extent, the builders of Germany's welfare state will feel about Merz's comments about the fact that it has supposedly become unsustainable. Anyway, we shall see. So, no real plan from the Europeans, the Americans, about what to do in relation to the war, how to end it. The Americans have taken certain steps. We've had an article, I think it was in the Wall Street Journal, about how the Pentagon, Pete Hegseth specifically, apparently, though I have no doubt that this went all the way up to the president, ordered that there will be no further assistance from the United States for deep missile strikes against Russia. So further ATACMS strikes against Russia, further strikes using Storm Shadow missiles against Russia. That apparently has ended. Of course, Ukraine does plan to conduct deep strikes against Russia itself. It may not be able to do that with ATACMS missiles or with Storm Shadows and Scalp missiles, which anyway only have a limited range. Its SAPSAN missile program, ballistic missile program, which would have produced a ballistic missile which might just possibly have had the range to reach Moscow. Anyway, that has apparently been mostly destroyed by the Russian military. But it does have the Flamingo missile, the new super long range, super heavy, super large cruise missile that the Ukrainians are displaying and which they say they will be able to produce in quantity. I cannot comprehend how missile strikes using this missile can effectively happen without some intelligence input from the United States. Just saying. So you should perhaps take this article in the Wall Street Journal, if it was the Wall Street Journal, about the United States forbidding deep strikes into Russia, with something, deep missile strikes deep into Russia, with something of a pinch of salt. Maybe what the Americans object to is the use of Western missiles, Storm Shadows, Scalps, Attackams, JASSMs missiles, perhaps Taurus missiles, rather than actual deep missile strikes into Russia. But whatever, it does seem that they are in the process of trying to distance themselves from any missile strikes deep into Russia that might eventually take place. And I think I'm right in saying, while I was on leave, that I read an article, though I only had a short time to read it quickly, and I'm not quite sure, again, of its accuracy, that the President of the United States has himself now made a decision that certain types of weapons, including apparently Patriot missiles, are no longer eligible for export to Ukraine because of the running down of the existing inventories. Again, even if that article, I'm remembering that article correctly, maybe you should take that with a pinch of salt as well, because I read another article which claimed that the United States is proposing to export to Ukraine certain short-range, rather slow subsonic speed air defense missiles. Presumably, these would be used against the Geran drones, but given the number of Geran drones that the Russians are producing, it seems to me that the number of these missiles that the United States might be sending to Ukraine would hardly be able to stem the onrush of the Geran drones when they start to strike Ukraine in the hundreds and the thousands come the autumn. Anyway, that's the situation as I see it geopolitically up to now. As I discussed in my program yesterday, we are in a quiet period. There is no real diplomacy going on at all at the moment. Ukraine has not agreed to the proposals from the Russians for the 3 working groups that will meet in Istanbul and discuss the way forward. The Russians have ruled out a meeting between Putin and Zelensky. They vetoed the idea of security guarantees of the sort the West is discussing for Ukraine. And at the moment, really, we don't have any clear approach, any clear way forward, given that Zelensky rejects all concessions, refuses to come forward with any real proposals as to how the war can be ended, continues to insist on his own demands. Now, a few weeks ago, 2 weeks ago in fact, just before the Washington meeting, I recall reading in, I think it was one of the American newspapers, an article which said that the United States, or at least some people in the Trump administration, were looking for Zelensky to come to the Washington meeting with constructive counter proposals for the Russian proposals, to the Russian proposals. Of course, unsurprisingly, he has come with none at all. Now, there have been rumours circulating that some people in Washington are absolutely fed up with Zelensky and want to see the end of him, and have been thinking of replacing Zelensky with General Zelensky. And of course, there was an article to that effect about 3 weeks ago, published by Seymour Hersh, saying that the administration, the Trump administration, has had enough of Zelensky, that they've finally lost patience with him, that they understand that he will never negotiate a resolution of the war, and that they are indeed now taking the first steps to remove him. Now, I was deeply skeptical about that article when it appeared. I pointed out that as far as I could see, Zelensky's position currently is strong and secure, and I believe that is still the case. But surprise, surprise, an article has appeared in the British media this time. I believe it was The Guardian, in fact, about more ideas and suggestions of replacing Zelensky with Zelensky. And it said that the Ukrainian embassy in London hosts a constant stream of visitors from various Western governments, all coming to speak to Zelensky in order to see whether he might be interested in making a move to oust Zelensky and to replace him as president. And apparently, in response to every one of these visitors, Zelensky says the same thing, that he has no intention or plan to act against Zelensky at the present time. He will only step in and seek to become president of Ukraine if Zelensky first resigns. And again, this same article said that some people in Kiev, who are also becoming increasingly alarmed about the crisis that Ukraine is falling further and deeper into, and who are of course aware of the deteriorating situation on the front lines, that some people are now becoming exasperated with Zelensky as well. They are becoming frustrated at his timorousness, his inability, his refusal to strike, something which Zelensky, of course, also failed to do when he was in a much stronger position last year, when he was still the general in command of Ukraine's armies. And they are perhaps so frustrated and exasperated with Zelensky, that maybe, just possibly, they will now start to look for someone else. Well, I myself do not believe that Zelensky is ever going to agree to any kind of compromise. Even if the towns, when the towns in Donbass start to fall and the Russians start to push towards the Dnieper. I don't believe that Zelensky has the ability or the capacity or the political space to compromise in the way that some people in Kiev and more people perhaps in Washington and even a few people in London now might want him to. But I also have to say this. I think that if Zelensky is pushed out of power in conditions of crisis, I've said this already, I doubt that this is going to stabilise the situation or open a route, a pathway towards an orderly negotiation with the Russians. I think if any attempt is made to remove Zelensky in that kind of way against his will. It will create instability and crisis in Ukraine. It will remove from the Ukrainian political system the one individual who still retains some level of authority and legitimacy. Someone who's been in power now for quite a long time, and somebody who has restructured the entire political and institutional system in Kiev successfully, it must be said, around himself. On the contrary, I think that if these people who want to replace Zelensky with Zelensky get their wish, then all that they will do, I've said this before, is they will accelerate the now inevitable collapse. Anyway, that now brings me at the conclusion of this video to a quick rundown of the military situation. And well, the first thing to say is that we've had less news from the Pokrovsk and Konstantinovka front, which is a sign that the Russians are moving. That has been the invariable situation when we stop hearing news from any part of the battlefronts. It's been true basically since the start of the special military operation, but it's been especially true since the Russians started to take the initiative after the failure of Ukraine's counteroffensive in 2023. The fact that there is no information or very little information coming from Pokrovsk, Konstantinovka, and from the area where the Russians have broken through between these two towns, the breakthrough area, is a sign that the Russian Defense Ministry has once again tightened the information flow. They've given warnings to all of the various telegram channels, to all of the various information channels and video channels, that at the moment important military operations are underway, and it is essential until these military operations have concluded that there be no leaks of information until then. And the one thing I've discovered about Russian telegram channels and Russian bloggers and people of that kind is that though these are some of the most quarrelsome, difficult to control people that you can imagine, they argue and quarrel and criticize. They are as difficult to manage as a herd of cats. Nonetheless, when they do get these kind of instructions from the Russian Defense Ministry, they invariably follow them. So that is why I suspect we're not getting information from the Pokrovsk-Konstantinovka area. There are rumors that the Russians now have cleared the entire Kliban-Beek area. There are rumors that the Russians have established a significant breakthrough positions in eastern Konstantinovka. There are also rumors, which, by the way, here I believe them to be true, that the Russians now control or rather are not controlled, but that they have made a successful breakthrough into the village of Shakhove to the northeast of Pokrovsk. This is a village north of Vladimirovka, which the Russians captured a few days ago. And if Shakhove is captured, then, as I said, the area of the breakthrough will have been massively expanded, and the Russians will be in a very, very strong position indeed to conduct encirclement operations, both of Pokrovsk and Konstantinovka. But to repeat, these are rumors at the moment. Quite likely these are all true, but it's possible that there are other things going on as well. It could be that the Russians are now mopping up in Rodinsk, north of Pokrovsk. And it could also be that the Russians are now pushing northwards from Kotlino and Udachny to the remaining E50 road. But if we are getting less information from this key area, the Pokrovsk-Konstantinovka area, the Ukrainians themselves are now admitting that there is a major crisis in the Liman-Siversk area. There's a Ukrainian report which says that the Russians have broken through so far and so fast that there is no proper front line anymore, that the Russians have the initiative right across this area, that there are many Ukrainian forces that have been left behind and which are trapped. This reminds me very much of the Kursk situation, by the way. When the Russians broke through in Kursk, again, there were lots of small groups of Ukrainian soldiers who were left behind and who the Russians then had to mop up. So we're being told that something very similar is now playing out in this area too. And to repeat it, what I've said already, the Russians are so far now to the west of Siversk, and Siversk itself is so far in a salient that I personally believe that the Ukrainians at some point in the next few days could quite plausibly order a withdrawal from Siversk. I think that Siversk has lost its relevance, its utility to the Ukrainians anymore. The entire Liman-Siversk area looks like it's collapsing. And I think that even Zelensky will probably eventually be persuaded that holding on to Siversk is simply to doom the Ukrainian troops who are defending it, an entire brigade, as I understand, basically to their fate, to no useful purpose. And I believe that it is not just Siversk which the Ukrainians are likely to withdraw from very soon, because we've now got a lot more information about the situation in Kupiansk, further to the north. The Russians have definitely occupied a significant area of northern Kupiansk, and it looks as if they're also in the industrial sector of Kupiansk, which is, by the way, located to the east of the Oskol River. But the Russians control all of the villages to the west of Kupiansk, and though there are some villages to the south of Kupiansk, which the Ukrainians still control, and there are some small roads into Kupiansk that they control as well, it seems that the Russians still already have drone control over all of these roads. And again, the situation in Kupiansk now is so critical that I understand even Ukrainian commentators are starting to say that the time has come to accept that there should be a withdrawal from the town. If not Ukrainian commentators exactly, then commentators who I would judge as being overall sympathetic to Ukraine. So Siversk, Kupiansk, perhaps a deepening crisis there, and the Russians probably doing something big in the Konstantinovka, Pokrovsk area as well. There was a similar shutdown of news before the Russian breakthrough northeast of Pokrovsk, and I suspect, as I said, something big is taking place there now. Now, there's also been Russian advances to the west in the western Donetsk area. The Russians have captured a village called Zaporozhye as they gradually push westwards towards the Dnieper, towards the city of Zaporozhye. As I said already, they now control this village of Plavny on the east bank of the Dnieper River, and it looks as if they have now captured significant parts of the fortified village of Stepnogorsk. There are reports that the first Russian FPV drones have been seen above the city of Zaporozhye itself. So that perhaps gives us a sense of the scale of the Russian advance. I suspect that the drone operators controlling those FPV drones are located in the southern territories, in Kamenskaya and Plavny and perhaps Stepnogorsk itself or the area around it, rather than the forces that are advancing towards Zaporozhye from the east. Now, there was a lot of talk a couple of days ago about a Ukrainian counterattack in western Donetsk. I've discussed in previous programs how these counterattacks are ephemeral, how all they do is lose Ukraine men and machines to no useful purpose. Exactly the same seems to be happening. The Russians have now stopped the Ukrainian counterattacks and are now counterattacking themselves. They've apparently recovered some of the ground that the Ukrainians recaptured. It looks as if an entire Ukrainian brigade was thrown into this attack, these counterattacks over the last week. It's suffering significant losses, apparently. And as I said, I suspect it will all have been for nothing. Again, more men, more machines killed and lost. Men and machines Ukraine doesn't have and cannot replace. And of course, it's the same story in the important counterattacks that took place that the Ukrainians organized north of Pakrovsk. Those appear to have had no real ultimate effect. And of course, General Syrskyi himself admitted that the counterattacks in Sumy region were unsuccessful as well. The counterattacks around Pakrovsk, it's fair to say, did result in a small boost to what has up to now been plunging Ukrainian morale. At least when I talk about plunging Ukrainian morale, perhaps more accurately, I mean the plunging morale of the authors of the Ukrainian Telegram channels and the bloggers and people of that kind. Over the last 2 days, I've noticed that their morale is starting to sink again. It's become clear that the Ukrainian counterattacks have been unsuccessful, that the Russians have held on to their critical advances, that the noose around Konstantinovka and Pakrovsk is tightening, and that in other parts of the front lines, the Russians continue to advance. And perhaps, again, a lot of the statements of support from Europe, the friendly attitude or seemingly friendly attitude to Zelensky from the President of the United States during the Washington meeting, all of that might have contributed a little to the uptick in Ukrainian morale. But I think as the days have passed, more and more people in Ukraine have come to understand that all of those meetings meant nothing in particular. All those fine words from Europe and the United States cannot in the end change anything. The situation continues to deteriorate for Ukraine. The Russians continue to get stronger. the Ukrainian army continues to get weaker. The Russians continue their methodical advance, their lava flow. The Ukrainians continue to struggle to try to hold it back, expending what remains of their strength in their efforts to do so. And that, I think, is where we are at this time in this war. It remains an extraordinary example of the sunk costs theory, that the Europeans continue to throw money at Zelensky and Ukraine in what is now a lost cause, even, as I said, as their economies and their finances sink. They can't apparently kick the habit of doing it. They tell each other, we can't let Ukraine fail or fall. The geopolitical catastrophe for us would be too great if it did. And all they're doing, of course, is they're throwing away more money and they're ensuring that the geopolitical catastrophe, when it comes, will be greater still. It never seems to occur to these people that what they're doing is also doing further and further harm to Ukraine itself, causing more men to die, more cities to be destroyed, more the Ukrainian economy plunge further and lower. But just go on giving money, just go on giving words of encouragement that you can never fulfill, make promises you cannot honour, continue to bankroll Zelensky, the most extraordinary person, in my opinion, to continue to support in that way. But then you could have said the same about people like President Thieu of South Vietnam. Anyway, go on bankrolling and supporting him until the Russians get to the Dnieper, until the Russian tank perhaps rolls up to Bankovo, the building which holds Zelensky's office in Kiev itself, until the Russians perhaps roll beyond the Dnieper, until they reach Lvov. Heaven knows until then. When? Well, on that very sour note, I'm going to finish today's programme with apologies again for its late appearance and its relative shortness. This is where I end today's programme. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programmes on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop. Links under this video. Last but not least, please remember, if you've liked this video, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Tomorrow, it will be business as usual. Thank you once more.